Cool.
All right, good morning, my fellow Westminsterites. Welcome, welcome. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jean Middlestad. I am the current chair of the Adult Ed Committee. I wanted to take a couple of moments and thank you for coming, but also to let you know what's coming up over the next couple of sessions. So this is the last day of Dr. Rohrbaugh's presentation. Next week, we will have Allie Duncan from Path Home. She's the development director of that organization. And she's going to be talking about this particular organization, which focuses on families with children to get back into housing and stay there. So obviously that is something that affects a lot of Portlanders. So I hope you will be there. That will be back down in the chapel, our venue. And then our last session on May 25th, that is the Sunday Memorial Day weekend. I hope you won't go camping and then you'll be here instead. We're going to have a new to us speaker. We're going to have the Reverend Rivka Gevertz, who is going to talk about widening our congregational welcome. And so, as I said, that will be our last event of the season, but we are hot into planning our next year. So if any of you has an idea that you'd like to see, please feel free to speak to me or anyone else on the committee or any of our pastors who can pass that on to us. So I would now like to welcome back Dr. Dave Rohrbaugh's. He finishes out his series, Dr. Rohrbaugh's.
So good morning. Good morning. You stay on one more week of this?
Oh, yes.
So we've been talking about how Christianity began to move up the social register in antiquity. And up to this point, we've identified two factors. One was geographical spread that began to create cultural and linguistic diversity. Second one was the introduction of writing. Both were inevitably an enormous impact on Christian faith and practice. But there are more factors we have to take into account. We're going to look at two more today. I don't mean to pretend that the four we've looked at in this class are the whole story. But I think we can make the case that these are four of the major factors in what developed in the early Christian church. So, today we're going to look at the rise of hierarchy within the leadership of the church itself. And finally, we're going to look at the marriage between church and state. Both of those factors had an enormous impact on what happened to early Christianity. And while the story today is not a particularly happy one, I think it's instructive, and I think it's got some lessons we need to remember for our current moment here at Westminster. So here we go. First, let's start with hierarchical leadership. As congregations began to develop in widely scattered geographical areas around the Greco-Roman world, primarily in its Eastern Greek-speaking half, but also to some degree in the Western Latin-speaking half of it, became obvious rather quickly that some kind of leadership was needed. So, in Acts, we are told the apostles decided to appoint deacons in every congregation. The word is diakonos in Greek. Its basic meaning is servant. But recent research has shown that the deacons of the early church were much more like what we today would call ministers. They said they had to do this to leave the apostles free to spread the story in new areas. The very first ones noted in the book of Acts, there are 7 of them, and they are all male. However, it's obvious that women were also appointed deacons in congregation. In the 16th chapter of Romans, Phoebe is called a deacon. What that means is there were women ministers in the earliest days of the ancient church. Book of Acts tells us the apostles planted churches, they also appointed elders. The Greek word is presbyteros, that's where we get our name. Presbyterian, elder. Okay? Titus, the book of Titus is told to appoint elders in every town. Now, in the New Testament, there is the second word that originally was applied to the people who are elders, and the word is episkopos. And you recognize that's the origin of the name Episcopal Church. The term has usually been translated in more recent years, bishop. That was not its original meaning. Its original meaning was simply overseer. Moreover, it's very obvious in the New Testament that the word elder and the word word episkopos apply to one and the same person. That is to say, they were simply 2 words for the same office. However, that began to change. And it began to because of cultural adaptation into the Roman world. Now, you remember last week we talked about cultural adaptation. The fact that when Christianity moves into a new geographical area, new culture group, and a new language, inevitably it has to adapt. If it doesn't, people won't understand it. But it also makes it workable in a new and different culture. So cultural adaptation began to affect the leadership of the early Christian church. It did because everywhere Romans went, everywhere they went, Roman law, Roman relationships, language, daily life, everything took on the flavor of Romanness. And moreover, the Roman world was absolutely obsessed with hierarchical ranking of everybody and everything. I'll tell you in a second more about that. A variety of ranking systems had developed over the generations in Rome. They used a number of different methods to rank everybody, but all of the different ranking methods were based on wealth. All of them. That determined everything in everybody's life. Were heavily impacted. In the Roman world, in the 1st century, at the time of Jesus, the vote of somebody in an election from the upper class counted many more times than the vote of somebody in the lower class. It affected legal rights. Who could go to court, who could not? Who could speak in court, and who could not? Even legal penalties in Roman law, if you were determined to be a crook by the court, the penalty you received depended on where you ranked in the order. Penalties for the lower, there were penalties for the upper folk were not. They were fines at most. Eligibility to join the military depended on where you were ranked. The rank of military officers depended on how much money they had. Pure and simple. Had nothing to do with ability. It was ranked on the basis of money. Eligible for political office, residence rights, who you could marry and who you couldn't. It even determined, folks, how many names you were allowed to have. So that if you were a freeborn Roman citizen, you could have 4 names. If you were a freed slave, but not a citizen, you could only have 3 names. If you were a slave, you could have only 1. And the emperor had 27. It determined what type of work you were permitted to do. In the time of Augustus, that is the first century, Roman citizens were not allowed to engage in manual labor. Obviously, it affected taxes. Now, we know that there had been many different systems, and it had gotten confusing. So Augustus, who was the emperor during the beginnings of the church, decided to create a whole new classification system. You remember reading in the Bible, and there was a census that all the world should be enrolled. Let me tell you what a census is for. It was not to count people. It's to determine where you fit in the ranking. You had to declare your name, your wife's name, how many children you had, how many slaves you own, all the property you own, every possession you own, all the way down to you had to make a listing of your wife, jewelry, and clothing. There were 2 people elected in the Roman world at that time who were called the censors. The censorship was the most prestigious office in Rome. Those 2 censors, after all the data was gathered, created a list of exactly where you rank in the record. Now we know what you're permitted to do, and where you're permitted to live, and what you do, where you go, and so on. So it is not surprising that as Roman culture began to Romanize Christianity, that this mania about ranking began to infect the church. The result of that was that bishops quickly moved a step up the ladder from elders. And now they began to be appointed as overseers in a rather strict sense of the term. Moreover, they became bishops not just of one congregation, but of the congregations in an area. So, for example, there could be a bishop of Alexandria who now was the overseer of all of the churches in the area of Alexandria. Gradually, what began to happen within the church itself is it began to replicate the hierarchical pattern of leadership that existed in society. Now, it's got to be pretty obvious to you what social rank those folk came from. They had to be literate, they had to be able to read and write, they had to know how to organize, they had to know how to rule. And so now we're beginning to develop a leadership in the church. There's a considerable distance up the social scale from where things began. Sad note, however. Didache, that's just a Greek word that means the teaching. It's a document from probably about the year 140. It was a kind of a compendium of early Christian belief and practice at the time. And it discusses the election of bishops and specifies that they must be male only. Which was, of course, the pattern in Greco-Roman society. Women did not hold office. So that ended male leadership in the church. Now, most scholars, I think there's a fairly wide scholarly consensus that what began to give energy and motivation to all of this were the theological squabbles going on among the now very diverse Christian churches. as Christianity became localized to the various areas in which it spread, it began to inevitably incorporate and adapt to local tradition. So it wasn't very long, as I said last week, before the Christianity of Egypt was markedly different than the Christianity of Greece, and far different from the Christianity way out in Spain. The result of this was that theological diversity created theological arguments that absolutely exploded in the 2nd century. That in turn meant that we had to have leaders who could defend themselves and the theology of their particular congregation, city, area. So now what we need are people who are genuinely upfront, aggressive, able to articulate spokespersons for the interests of particular congregations. And so Jerome, for example, now he's a little bit later, he's in the 5th century, but he's looking back at what has happened in the generations before him. He said, factionalism of this period led bishops into intensive rivalry, demagoguery, denunciations of each other as false teachers and heretics. In other words, the theology police got overtime. So this kind of fighting inevitably began to destroy the unity of the church. It simply did. Localized theological trends now begin to become mandatory. You can't be a Spanish Christian and live in Alexandria. You can't do that. You have to adapt to what's happening in Alexandria, its theology, and its belief and practice. Dissenters began to be punished or exiled. New gospels got written, ones that reflect our understanding, not that of those miserable folks over there. Church councils were called, smaller ones, to try to settle these issues, but it didn't. All it did was cement the difference. So factionalism became a dominant reality in the church. And all of this meant that the leadership of the church was increasingly drawn from the educated, now politically connected, and powerful leadership of the various communities in the empire. Now, one of the things we have to take into account, I don't know how many of you know this, but countries, nations are a modern invention. They did not exist in antiquity. The polity in antiquity was formed around the city. So you could be a citizen of Alexandria, or a citizen of Athens, or a citizen of Rome. You were never a citizen of a country. So what this meant was that politically, leaving religion aside, politically, the cities of the Roman Empire were rivals, bitter rivals, who fought with each other frequently. One of those cities that gradually began gaining dominance was Rome, who conquered Corinth and Athens and Alexandria, so on down the line. So city rivalry was actually a huge part of ancient life. So it's not surprising that over a generation or two, the Christianity of dominant cities became the dominant Christianity in an area. A great example is Antioch and Alexandria. Alexandria in the 1st century was actually the largest city in the Roman realize that till I was digging around in this stuff. It was also the best educated and by far the most beautiful. Rome was later beautified by the Emperor Augustus. But early on, Alexandria was sort of the intellectual and aesthetic leader of much of the Roman world. And their bitter rivalry was those miserable folks over there in Antioch. Antioch was the largest city in what is now Turkey, was then called Asia Minor. So the two cities, politically, leaving religion aside, have been rivals for many, many years. It's inevitable, therefore, that the churches in the two cities began to become rivals. So we have denunciations of Alexandrian theology from writers in Antioch, and we have denunciations of Antioch's theology from writers in Alexandria. What that means is that Christianity was getting drawn into the theological tension, pushing and shoving of the Roman world, which again demanded leaders with considerable ability and education and resources in order to hold their own. So both of these were centers of Christian growth, and so political wrangling between them eventually became theological wrangling. What that meant was the bishops now became the major theology police, making sure that you stayed loyal, not only politically, but religiously. A hierarchical leadership came to mimic the ranking and ordering of Roman society. That absolutely changed where Christianity was perceived to be in the public mind. Now, the next section of this story is not a happy one. The fourth factor that I want to look at is the marriage between the interests of church and state. From what I've told you about city rivalry and hence religious rivalry, you can't be surprised to recognize that political interests and religious interests began to walk the same path. To understand this fully, I want to jump all the way to the end of the 4th century. In the year 284, under the Emperor Diocletian, a vicious persecution of Christians broke out empire-wide. In fact, it was the only persecution that encompassed the entire Roman world. His stated goal was to wipe Christianity out. And his reasoning was that because it was the gods of Rome who had ordained their prominence in the world and protected their leadership in the world, the failure to worship the gods of Rome would destroy the empire. Because Christians refused to do that, he launched this massive and vicious persecution of Christians that lasted for 10 years. So it was gruesome and it was terrifying, but it failed. It failed miserably, actually. As a result, Diocletian resigned, the only Roman emperor ever to do that. He resigned, gave it up, and left. The result of that was that war broke out, civil war broke out. Civil war had plagued Roman society periodically through its entire history. But after Diocletian resigned, civil war broke out as new people began to vie for leadership and the emperorship in the empire. To make a long story short, after some years of that, Constantine prevailed. And I want you to notice what he said when he had won the final battle. He said that he had seen a vision of the cross and was told, in this sign, comfort. That's the earliest of an attempt to marry Christianity and military. I don't think people at the time really understood the really dark implications of that. He saw this vision. The result was that he won a battle at the Milvian Bridge and was told in this sign, conquer. In 313, when he had become the full emperor, Constantine issued an edict of toleration. Did not make Christianity the religion of the empire. He issued an edict of toleration that said the law now is that all religions are tolerated. Now, it's the very first time that he had legal right to exist in the Roman Empire. But Constantine's edict also gave all the other religions the same kind of protection. Now, very quickly, there's no doubt, by the way, that Constantine's mother, Helena, was a committed Christian. Lots of evidence that throughout her life. We'll be back to Constantine's Christianity in a minute. But it wasn't very long after the Edict of Toleration that he went on a massive building spree, building churches, temples, missions all over the empire. And it was clear, even to people then, that it was an attempt to create unity in the empire. That was a serious problem. They had just had a civil war. They had had repeated civil wars. They were now more ethnically and linguistically diverse than their history, and unity was an issue. And it's obvious that Constantine was trying to do that. What turned out was that the church was not as united as Constantine. Hence, not the vehicle he had hoped it might be to create unity in the empire. The theological disputes that were going on in the early years of Constantine's reign threatened to upset everything. So Constantine, very naively, in my view, decided to convene a great council called the Council of Nicaea. It produced the Nicene Creed, which is still in use today. And it was the result of long debates that Constantine attended in the city of Nicaea, in which bishops from around the Christian world, interestingly, missing Bishop of Rome, wasn't there. They decided to see if they could create a common theological creed. But it didn't work. The bishop who had been on one side was arguing for what we today would call the Trinity. The bishop on the other side, Arius, was arguing that Jesus was spirit-filled, but not God. And the debate was, we have all the notes from that debate. They still exist. You can go read them. In the end, they had a vote. And in the vote, it was 3 in favor of Arius and 2 others. And all the rest of the 200 or so bishops voted against him. The result of that was that Arius was exiled, as were the 2 who voted with him. And the Nicene Creed was adopted by that great council of the church. It was a creed that anyone who owned copies of the writings of Arius should be put to death. You think the word theology, please, is inappropriate? I got news for you. These other bishops were exiled to illiterate in the Balkan Peninsula, or Bulgaria. It's now. And all the writings of Arius were ordered to be burned. So the result was that theological wrangling did not end. It continued, and in fact, it continued all the rest of Constantine's life. Now, one of the not interesting to everybody, but interesting to me, debates among scholars was Constantine a Christian? Well, the evidence is very mixed. He said he was, but his behavior was bad. As I said, he was very enthusiastic in his support of the church and its mission, but he had used the sign of the cross as a military inspiration. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Moreover, he almost never went to church. Very, very rarely attended any kind of public worship. He wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. And on his deathbed, folks, he was baptized by a bishop associated with the area. Moreover, when you look at the monuments that he built all over the place, they are full of symbols of worship of the sun. There are no Christian symbols on the inscriptions and monuments that he built. The Arch of Constantine, which still is standing, it's in the Roman Forum, you can go see it today, is full of symbols of Sol Invictus. There are no Christian symbols. So, but you just can't get away from this. The fact is, he was a brutal, violent egomaniac. He killed his own wife and his own eldest son because he thought they were rivals. Was he a Christian? I don't know. I might have liked to have had a weak conversation.
Did he hold the Bible upside down?
But
Did he hold the Bible upside down?
So Christianity became so Romanized during the lifetime of Constantine that it took on a military tone, a preference for Latin, network of hierarchical rulers, bishops, cardinals, popes, a distinctly Roman taste for monumental architecture and spectacular ritual. So, Christianity may have Christianized the Roman world to some degree, but to an enormous degree, Rome Romanized Christianity. What about right after Constantine died? Well, surprise, surprise, we had a new civil king. Now it was among three sons of Constantine. They eventually settled it by dividing the empire into three areas, and each one got to rule one part of it. However, one of the sons, Constantius, gradually gained supremacy over the others and became sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Now, there is no doubt that Constantius was more Christian, at least in his behavior, than his father Constantine. He was enthusiastic advocate. In fact, he became a rather fierce advocate of it. One of his immediate successors was an emperor called Theodosius I. There is no doubt about the fierce, dominating attitude of Theodosius toward Christianity. In 381, he made Christianity the official religion of the empire and outlawed all other religions. Moreover, he made the Nicene Creed mandatory. It became the law of the land. He began to use it as a tool of political authority. He began to force its adoption, all part of the Roman Empire. And people were either severely punished or forced into exile if they refused to adopt. I'm sorry, I don't care what the Nicene Creed says theologically, I will not say it. I'm sorry, but it's just too offensive when you realize how that thing originated and what it became in the early Christian world. So Theodosius replaced governors of provinces and areas with bishops, who now became the political authorities in various areas and were responsible for the theology beliefs enforcing the Nicene Creed there. So we now have a Christianity led by members of the 1%, not just the retainers who could read and write. We're now at the very top of the political, military world of Rome. To give you an idea how far up the scale we are, to be in the top class of the Roman world, you had to demonstrate at the time of the census that you had 250,000 times the average daily wage in liquid assets. That's what you had to have to be in the ruling class. And it meant that those kind of folk were now among the leadership of the church. To be a provincial official, you only had to have 125,000 times the average. I'm curious, so I calculated that in today's dollars. $30 million. You ought to be worth $30 million in the work to pull one of these off. We have now arrived full-blown at a Christian nationalism. We can't follow the story any farther, but I can tell you that what happened thereafter is among the ugliest and most horrific chapters in all of human history. The role that the church played in the medieval world was political, military, and authoritarian in the extreme. Well, what I've shown you today is how that developed. So we can't follow it anymore, but we know now that Christianity is the top of the social register, that it's married totally with politics, and it's become truly ugly and evil. I want to hasten to add that Jesus' message of concern for the poor did not die out. In fact, it stayed alive in local congregations. It even stayed alive among some of the aristocracy. When a fellow named Chrysostom was the bishop of Constantinople, he had the temerity to invite the queen to dinner and serve her on plates rather than gold. He was deposed of his office in exile. You ought to read his sermons. They are powerful and deeply understanding of care for the poor that was a part of the original Christian message. So I want to make clear that in spite of all of the nationalistic ugly stuff that occurred as the result of this, the message, Jesus' message of care for the poor did not die. It kept resurfacing, and has resurfaced repeatedly in Christian history. Unfortunately, so also has Christianity. It has come back again and again and again, as rulers have used Christianity to consolidate their power. So, in some degree, the church had had Christianized the emperor, but the empire had Romanized the church. What about us at Westminster? We need to be honest, folks, about the fact that we are not at the bottom of the register. This congregation is highly educated. All of us can read and write. Many of us have considerable financial resources. We are the kind of people who first began to take the leadership positions in the church before it unfortunately took the last step to Christian nationalism. That could mean that we're in a somewhat precarious position. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think I'm actually proud to say that Westminster is not an occasion for that kind of stuff. But I'd like to end this by reminding us of words of Jesus that people like us need to take seriously. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, right? Their great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Or as Jesus also said, this is the first commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment greater than these. I'm happy to say that I see that here. And I just want to remind us that we need to remember that. Enough. Time for questions.
Do you have any impressions about the new pope that you want to do?
She asked, do I have any impressions of the new pope that I'd like to share? I don't know any more about him than you do, but what's been in the press. Given his years of mission work in Peru, it's very clear that he has kept the dream alive that began with Jesus. I think his concern for the poor is impressive. And his life shows he's committed to it. I find that hopeful.
Yeah.
Folks, we do have a microphone for anyone who would like to ask a question. So if you'll raise your hand, I'll bring it to you. That way our colleagues on Zoom can also hear us.
There was actually a story in one of the papers I read this morning in which he had commented a meeting of the cardinals that his objective was to continue the attitude of Francis, which is very hopeful. Can't say the same for hope.
Wasn't the choice of his name Leo also a continuation of Leo the 13th, who at the end of the 19th century was very concerned for social conditions for the working.
Exactly. Exactly. And so that's all very encouraging to see. How those people sort of rose to the fore in the Catholic Church, I don't know, but God bless everything. Other question.
Here you go.
Yeah, Dick, I'm curious, I know you're a Greek scholar. At what point did Latin phase out Greek in terms of the written language that became distributed around the empire?
Did you all hear that? It's actually a rather interesting thing. If we had time to follow the story, what you would discover is that in the eastern half of the Greek, which was entirely composed of Greek-speaking cities. Greek culture and language Christianity lasted all the way up to, let's say, the 11th century. But in the West, after Theodosius, Latin became the dominant language of the Western Church. Attempts were made over the centuries to get the Eastern and the Western churches talking to each other. It finally broke entirely in the 11th century. And the Greeks formed the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Westerners formed the Roman Catholic Church. But what not everybody realizes is that when that happened, that breakup happened, that was the split between the two largest groups, but there are other splits that occurred at about the same time from other cultural and linguistic groups. Did you know there is a Romanian Orthodox Church? There is a Syrian Orthodox Church. There is a Coptic Orthodox Church. And interestingly, folks, they not only use their languages, they have their own New Testament. And it includes different books than ours. How many of you ever read the Syriac Gospel of the Blessed Virgin Mary? That's the most prominent book in the Syrian Orthodox canon. So, while there are two major branches, there are smaller ones that have developed into a wide variety of areas around the world. And each has its own story. Thank you. I'm half deaf, folks.
I'm curious about, since, you know, our congregation looks at these two of love your God, love your neighbor. What was the main Christian message of that Constantine, of the 1% of the elders and the bishops at that time that were what was the main Christian message?
Nicene Creed capitalizes what I think most, you know, I told you last week, I have a love-hate relationship with theology. What you don't see when you read the Nicene Creed is what's between the lines. Let me just use an example of the struggle. What struggle is embedded in a lot of this theological language. When Julius Caesar died, the Roman Senate divinized him. He became a god. What did that make his son? Son of God. At the time of Jesus, that was one of the titles for Augustus. The Nicene Creed says Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. The emphasis there is on only, not Son of God. It's on only. In other words, it was clearly a pot shot. Theodosius was a little dense. He didn't get it. But at least some of the discussion at the Council of Nicaea, it's very clear that what they were saying is the ultimate ruler is Jesus, not the emperor. Those kind of things that are embedded and hidden between the lines of theology make this whole mess very complicated, very difficult to figure out. In fact, I could show you that the Nicene Creed has meant different things to different people who have used it centuries. Because what we do is we tend to import into the theological language we use. We tend to import the perceptions we have of reality and life and so on. The message of Theodosius was, I'm the top dog and Christianity is the only religion and you better shut up or you're out of here. And they began to argue that the only possibility of salvation was in that group, and so all the rest of you, sorry, you're damned to hell. And it's just appalling crap in my view, but it's meant many different things to many people. But the political overtones of the theological message of Theodosius is really quite repulsive. And it never meant much to the poor folks, I guarantee you. But they kept the message alive.
Thank you, Dick. I hesitate to ask this, but the thing that's been running through my head during the hymn, onward Christian soldiers marching on to war. So that's exactly what we have with the Roman Empire. That's exactly what we have with all the other divisions, and to some extent we have it now. So how does this correlate with the teachings of Jesus? Not in the new hymn.
Do any of you know who wrote this hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers? And when? It became the favorite hymn in the British Empire in the 1800s. Which is when it was written. Surprise, surprise. Christian nationalism again. It's plagued the church all the way along. Yes.
You talked about the connection between your hierarchy in the church based on how much money you had. How about the influence of the money going back to the church when you're in that hierarchy? How much of that money actually was used to help the poor and whatever? I mean, did they contribute, did they offer some of their resources back to the church?
Oh, man, what an important question. You all get that?
Resources.
He said it.
Going to the poor.
Yeah, he said, given all the money that you had to have to be a leader in the Roman world, when the church got into leadership, did any of the money that began to pour it go back to the poor? You really ought to read the sermons of Christmas. He has a sermon in which he said, if 3 people in our congregation would tithe their wealth and give it to the poor, there would not be a poor person left in the city of Constantine. There's another one of the early church leaders who kept the message alive, preached a sermon in which he said, there you stand, confused about what floor covering you want for your new mansion, while the poor man is begging for a meal out the front gate of your house. So some folks kept the message alive and they tried to shift money toward the poor. Chrysostom, who got exiled because he entertained the queen with clay plates. He sold all of the gold and silver that was in the bishop's control in the church and gave it to poor people. And for that he got exiled again. So yeah, some did. But unfortunately, a lot didn't. And you would not have sermons like those from Basil or Cyprian or Chrysostom or some of these and Augustine preachers of the earlier church were almost shouting at people to remember the message of Jesus. You wouldn't have that occurring if it wasn't a problem. Yes.
Well, 2 things. One is, years ago, Tom and I and Tom's parents, when they were alive, went to northwestern France on the World War II remembrance trip with Hank, Tom's dad. And we went to a little private museum put together by 2 sons whose grandfather had fought in the French resistance. And they had all kinds of little pieces of art, artifacts they put together. And one was a rug from the officers of Hitler's Germany when they occupied France. And the translation was God finished England, woven into the rug. It just meant this, yeah.
God, what?
Finish England. In the rug, in the hand. Anyway, my question is, how can we get a copy of those sermons and read them? How do we do that?
They're all on the internet.
Yeah.
Okay. That reminds me, let me quick say this, just People ask often to have these notes. I'm gonna send them to the church office so you can get copies of them. And at the end, there's a bibliography. It's short, but it's from theologians who rehearse some of this stuff. There is one book that's in my little bibliography called, the title is Christ and Empire. And it will tell you a lot about some of those people. But yeah, they're all available on the internet. If you just Google Chrysostom, you'll be able to find it.
Question. All of this happened during the Flat Earth Society. And yet somehow, so much of our hymns, so much of our, I think, theology tends to be a three-layered universe. You know, we somehow have never gotten rid of the Flat Earth Society in terms of how we aren't moving out of that.
It's true. Old beliefs die hard. They just do. Folks, we're out of time and we have to quit, but can I end by just saying how encouraged I am when I hear the message of Jesus.